Cain is still on his knees in the open field where his brother just died, and in the very next verse, Genesis quietly hands him a wife it never names, inside a world the text insists holds only 4 people. You're about to meet her, the woman Cain married, the city he built despite a curse to wander forever, and the strangers he was suddenly afraid would kill him. None of that fits the simple math of 4 people on earth. And Genesis never once stops to explain it. For 2,000 years, that silence has bothered careful readers, including one towering Christian theologian who felt he had to answer it directly. But one book, kept whole for over 1,000 years by a single church most of the Western world forgot to ask, actually names her. By the end, you'll hear that name, and why almost no one else kept it. Go back to the very beginning of this story, to the reason Cain was ever standing in that field alone. Cain and his younger brother Abel each brought God an offering, one from the soil he worked, one from the flock he tended. Cain offered the literal fruit of his labor from the ground. Abel offered the firstborn of his flock and its richest portions, the very best of what he had, not merely some of it. Only one offering pleases God, and Scripture never fully explains why. You can feel Cain's anger building in the text itself. His face falls, and God warns him plainly that sin is crouching at his door, waiting to master him. Cain doesn't listen. Out in that same open field, he turns on his own brother, and Abel becomes the first human being the Bible ever records dying. God confronts him immediately afterward. "Where is your brother?" And Cain's answer becomes one of the most quoted lines in the whole Bible. "Am I my brother's keeper?" The ground itself, God tells him, has opened its mouth to take Abel's blood, and Cain's sentence is exile, cursed from the soil, a restless wanderer for the rest of his life. Then Cain says something that doesn't add up at all. "Whoever finds me will kill me," Cain says to God, and that single sentence has puzzled careful readers for as long as this book has existed. By this point in Genesis, the world is supposed to hold exactly 4 people: Adam, Eve, Cain, and now a dead Abel. So who, exactly, is Cain so afraid of? God doesn't correct him, or ask what he means. Instead, God marks Cain, a sign meant to warn off whoever might find him, as if entire other people were already an accepted fact. God even promises 7-fold vengeance on anyone who kills Cain regardless, an unusually severe protection clause for a confessed murderer, in a story that keeps assuming an entire unnamed population all around him. This exact gap in the text is old. Centuries ago, the theologian Augustine of Hippo felt he had to address it directly, arguing there must have been far more people alive than Genesis ever bothered to name. It's a question skeptics have used for centuries too, pointing at Cain's wife and his fear of strangers as proof this story doesn't hold together as straightforward history. But look closer at the text itself, and Genesis already answers its own question, just a few verses later, in a single line most readers skim straight past. Genesis chapter 5 tells you, almost as a footnote, that Adam lived another 800 years after his third son Seth was born, and had more sons and daughters in all that time. The text never counts them, never names most of them, but it never pretends they don't exist either. By the time Cain is old enough to marry, entire generations could already have been alive. So the strangers Cain fears, and the wife he marries, were likely close family, sisters, nieces, distant cousins, in a world this early, long before any law forbade it. That answers the math. It doesn't answer the one question everyone actually wants resolved: who, specifically, was she? Genesis answers the identity question with exactly 4 words: Cain knew his wife, and then moves straight on, as if her name were the least important detail in the whole account. By then, Cain has already left everyone behind anyway, walking east of Eden into a place Genesis calls the land of Nod, and even that name hides something. In Hebrew, the word Nod doesn't read like an ordinary place name at all. It comes from the same root as the word for wandering. God had just sentenced Cain to be a restless wanderer on the earth. Then Cain walks into a land whose very name means, roughly, wandering. That's either a striking coincidence, or the land was never meant to be a real place on any map. Many scholars now read Nod as a kind of wordplay, a name that describes Cain's punishment rather than pinning down real geography, closer to calling a place nowhere than giving it a street address. That reading doesn't make the story less real. It just means this particular detail is doing something different than a modern reader expects, describing a state, not marking coordinates on the ground. And yet, into this land whose name literally means wandering, the wanderer does something no one expects. He stops moving, and starts building something permanent. A man just cursed to wander the earth forever builds the Bible's very first city, and names it after his own son, Enoch. That single detail sits strangely against everything that came before it. Wandering people don't usually build walls. Walls are what people build when they plan to stay in one place for a very long time. Archaeologists don't actually find real walled cities this early in the physical record. The earliest excavated ones date many thousands of years after this story is set, which tells you this detail is doing something other than reporting a literal urban plan. Some readers see defiance in Cain's choice, refusing the wandering God assigned him. Others see something gentler, a father protecting the one family he has left in a dangerous, half-empty world. The first-century Jewish historian Josephus wrote about this same city too, describing Cain as forcing his household to settle and fortify it out of fear, rather than any real change of heart. Either way, this city needed more than one household to survive: walls, food stores, defense. Which means, by the time Cain names it, he isn't living alone with just one wife anymore. So Cain has a wife, a son, and now a city full of people around him, and Genesis still hasn't told you her name. That silence isn't an accident. It's a pattern. Cain's wife isn't the only woman Genesis lets vanish into two words, his wife, and nothing else. Noah's wife steers her family through the flood without ever once being named. Lot's wife is remembered only for what she was told not to do, and for what she became instead. This isn't carelessness. In a text this carefully structured, the silence itself is a choice. These books were written to record consequence and covenant, not a census of every name involved. For most of Christian and Jewish history, that silence about Cain's wife specifically was simply left standing, generation after generation, completely unresolved. Until, eventually, tradition did what Scripture chose not to. It gave her a story, and eventually, a name. Jewish tradition's oldest answer to who Cain married is the obvious one hiding in the math already: he married his own sister. Early rabbinic commentators leaned on that exact line in Genesis 5, other sons and daughters, to argue sibling marriage was never explicitly forbidden this early, before any law existed to forbid it. It's an answer that unsettles a modern reader, and the text itself seems to sense that discomfort, never lingering on it, never explaining it away, never revisiting it again. For most of Jewish and Christian tradition, that was as far as it went: an unnamed sister, and an unspoken assumption nobody pushed much further. But one text, written centuries before the New Testament, refused to leave it there at all. It's called the Book of Jubilees, a retelling of Genesis written roughly 2,200 years ago, so detailed it fills in almost every gap the original leaves open. Its own text claims to be a message given to Moses on Mount Sinai, organizing the entire span of biblical history into 49-year Jubilee cycles, which is exactly where its modern name comes from. It wasn't some obscure fringe text either. Jewish communities in the centuries before Jesus read it widely and copied it often enough that fragments of it later turned up at Qumran, alongside the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves. Ancient writers who quoted it even had their own nickname for it, Little Genesis, because line by line, it retells the same early chapters of the Bible, just with far more of the blanks filled in. Jubilees doesn't just add color to Genesis. It systematically names people Genesis leaves anonymous, dates events precisely, and adds entire conversations, exactly the kind of detail a curious reader keeps wanting. Which means Jubilees had every reason, and every opportunity, to answer the one question about Cain that Genesis itself never does. And Jubilees does answer it. It gives Cain's wife an actual name, Awan. Jubilees names her plainly as Cain's own sister, a daughter of Adam and Eve, born some years after Cain and Abel, exactly the family line answer Jewish tradition had already guessed at. Jubilees doesn't just name her, it dates her, fitting her birth into the same 49-year Jubilee calendar the whole book uses to organize everything else, the way a careful genealogy might list an exact year. The same text goes further still, naming Seth's wife too, a second daughter of Adam and Eve, called Azura, as if the author couldn't stand leaving either silence unfilled. Jubilees even gives Awan a role beyond the single wedding line Genesis allows her, present, by its account, at the very naming of that first city, standing beside Cain and their son. For one small line in one ancient book, the wife the Bible never explained suddenly has a name, a family, and a place in the story. Which raises the far more interesting question: if this answer has existed for over 2,000 years, why have you probably never heard it? The honest answer has nothing to do with the text being fake, and everything to do with which books different communities chose to keep as scripture, and which they didn't. After the Jewish temple fell in the year 70, Rabbinic Judaism settled on a narrower list of sacred books, and Jubilees wasn't on it. Most of Western Christianity followed a similarly narrow list not long after. For well over 1,000 years, the West knew this text only secondhand, quoted in fragments by a handful of early Christian writers. Then, in the mid-1800s, complete Ethiopic manuscripts finally reached European scholars, and a German Orientalist named August Dillmann published the first real edition, opening this book back up to the West, because one church, in one country, had simply never stopped keeping it. That church is the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, and its Bible has always looked different from the one on a typical Western shelf. Its Old Testament runs to 81 books in total, roughly 20 more than most Protestant Bibles carry, and Jubilees sits inside that list as fully canonical scripture, not as a curiosity in an appendix. For over 1,000 years, monks in Ethiopian monasteries copied Jubilees by hand in Ge'ez, the church's ancient liturgical language, generation after generation, without ever treating it as lost or disputed. And this wasn't a Bible written in isolation. In the 1950s, fragments of that very same Book of Jubilees turned up among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, proof the text really did circulate in the ancient Jewish world, exactly as old as Ethiopia's own tradition always said it was. By the time scholars finished counting, at least 14 separate copies of Jubilees had turned up at Qumran alone, more surviving ancient copies than for several books that did make it into every Bible. So the Ethiopian Church didn't invent Awan's name centuries later to patch a hole. It simply never stopped holding a book the rest of Christianity had let slip out of its hands. Which means the wife the Bible never explains was never actually unexplained everywhere. She was only unexplained in the specific books most people happened to be handed. Go back, now, to that city Cain built, the one named after his son, because Jubilees doesn't just name Awan. It tells you what she was actually doing there. According to Jubilees, Awan isn't a passing footnote in Cain's story. She's there at his side through the exile east of Eden, through Enoch's birth, through the razing of that first city's walls. In the text's own telling, she isn't a plot device or an afterthought. She's the reason there's a family at all still standing in the land of Nod. None of that makes it into the version of Genesis sitting on most shelves. Not her name, not her presence at that founding, not one word of it. Which leaves you with the actual, honest shape of this mystery, not a hidden conspiracy, just two very different decisions, made by two different communities, about how much of the story was worth keeping. Genesis chose restraint, naming only what mattered to the covenant it was tracking. Ethiopia chose memory, keeping every name anyone thought was worth writing down. So somewhere in that quiet land whose very name meant wandering, a woman without a single line in most Bibles once stood beside the first city ever built, and in at least one very old book, still kept whole by people who never forgot her, she has always had a name.